The starry sky seemed very near the treetops to Luke as he and his friends were carried into the Ewok village. He wasn't even aware it was a village at first. The tiny orange sparks of light in the distance he thought initially to be stars. This was particularly true when, dangling on his back, strapped to the pole as he was, the fiery bright points flickered directly above him between the trees. But then he found himself being hoisted up intricate stairways and hidden ramps around the immense trunks, and gradually the higher they went, the bigger and cracklier the lights became. When the group was hundreds of feet up in the trees, Luke finally realized the lights were bonfires among the treetops. They were finally taken out into a rickety wooden walkway, far too far off the ground to be able to see anything below them but the abysmal drop. For one bleak moment, Luke was afraid they were simply going to be pitched over the brink to test their knowledge of Force lore. But the Ewoks had something else in mind. The narrow platform ended midway between two trees. The first creature in line grabbed hold of a long vine and swung across the far trunk, which Luke could see, by twisting his head around, had a large cave-like opening carved into its titanic surface. Vines were quickly tossed back and forth across the chasm until soon a kind of lattice was constructed, and Luke found himself being pulled across it on his back, still tied to the wooden poles. He looked down once into the nothingness. It was an unwelcome sensation. On the other side, they rested on a shaky, narrow platform until everyone was across. Then the diminutive monkey bears dismantled the webbing of vines and proceeded into the tree with their captives. It was totally black inside, but Luke had the impression it was more of a tunnel through the wood than an actual cavern. The impression of dense, solid walls was everywhere, like a burrow in a mountain. When they emerged 50 yards beyond, they were in the village square. It was a series of wooden platforms, planks, and walkways connecting an extensive cluster of enormous trees. Supported by this scaffolding was a village of huts constructed of an odd combination of stiffened leather, daub and wattle, thatched roofs, mud floors. Small campfires burned before many of the huts. The sparks were caught by an elaborate system of hanging vines, which funneled them into a smothering point, and everywhere were hundreds of Ewoks. Cooks, tanners, guards, grandfathers, mother Ewoks gathered up squealing babies at the sight of the prisoners and scurried into their huts or pointed or murmured. Dinner smoke filled the air, children played games, minstrels played strange, resonant music on hollow logs, windy reeds. There was vast blackness below, vaster still above, but here in this tiny village suspended between the two, Luke felt warmth and light and special peace. The entourage of captors and captives stopped being the largest hut. Luke, Chewie, and R2 were leaned on their poles against a nearby tree. Han was tied to a spit and balanced above a pile of kindling that looked suspiciously like a barbecue pit. Dozens of Ewoks gathered around and chattering curiously in animated squeals. Tebow emerged from the large structure. He was slightly bigger than most of the others and undeniably fiercer. His fur was a pattern of light and dark gray stripes. Instead of the usual leathery hood, he wore a horned animal half-skull atop his head, which he further adorned with feathers. He carried a stone hatchet, and even for someone as small as an Ewok, he walked with a definite swagger. He examined the group curiously, then seemed to make some kind of pronouncement. At that, a member of the hunting party stepped forward, Paplu, the mantled Ewok who seemed to have taken a more protective view toward the prisoners. Tebow conferred with Paplu for a short time. The discussion soon turned into a heated disagreement, however, with Paplu apparently taking the rebel side and Tebow seemingly dismissing whatever considerations arose. The rest of the tribe stood around watching the debate with great interest, occasionally shouting comments or squeaking excitedly. 3PO, whose litter throne had been set down in a place of honor near the stake to which Solo was tied, followed the ongoing argument with rapt fascination. He began to translate once or twice for Luke and the others, but stopped after only a few words, since the debaters were talking so fast. He didn't want to lose the gist of what was being said. Consequently, he didn't transmit any more information than the names of the Ewoks involved. Han looked over at Luke with a dubious frown. "I don't like the looks of this." Chewie growled his wholehearted agreement. Suddenly, Logray exited from the large hut, silencing everyone with his presence. Shorter than Tebow, he was nonetheless clearly the object of greater general respect. He too wore a half-skull on his head, some kind of great bird skull, a single feather tied to its crest. His fur was striped tan, though, and his face wise. He carried no weapon, only a pouch at his side, and a staff topped by the spine of a once powerful enemy. One by one he carefully appraised the captives, smelling Han, testing the fabric of Luke's clothing between his fingers. Tebow and Paplu babbled their opposing points of view to him, but he seemed supremely uninterested, so they soon stopped. When Logray came to Chewbacca, he became fascinated and poked at the Wookiee with his staff of bones. Chewie took exception to this, though. He growled dangerously at the tiny bear man. Logray needed no further coaching and did a quick backstep, at the same time reaching into his pouch and sprinkling some herbs in Chewie's direction. "Careful, Chewie," Han cautioned from across the square. "He must be the head honcho." "No," 3PO corrected. "Actually, I believe he's their medicine man." Luke was about to intervene, then decided to wait. It would be better if this was serious little community came to its own conclusions about them in its own way. The Ewoks seemed curiously grounded for a people so air. Logray wandered over to examine R2-D2, a most wondrous creature. He sniffed, tapped, and stroked the droid's metal shell, then scrunched up his face in a look of consternation. After a few moments of thought, he ordered the small robot cut down. The crowd murmured excitedly and backed off a few feet. R2's vine binders were slashed by two knife-wielding guards, causing the droid to slide down his pole and crash unceremoniously to the ground. The guards set him upright. R2 was instantly furious. He zeroed in on Tebow as the source of his autonomy, and beeping a blue streak, began to chase the terrified Ewok in circles. The crowd roared, some cheering on Tebow, some squeaking encouragement to the deranged droid. Finally, R2 got close enough to Tebow to zing him with an electric charge. The shocked Ewok jumped into the air, squealed raucously, and ran away as fast as his stubby little legs could carry him. Wicket slipped surreptitiously into the big hut as the onlookers screeched their indignation or delight. 3PO was incensed. "R2, stop that! You're only going to make matters worse." R2 scooted over directly in front of the golden droid and began beeping a vehement tirade. This outburst muffled 3PO substantially. With a haughtily tilt, he sat up straight in his throne. "That's no way to speak to someone in my position." Luke was afraid of the situation, was well on its way to getting out of control. He called with the barest hint of impatience to his faithful droid. "3PO, I think it's time you spoke on our behalf." 3PO rather ungraciously actually turned to the assemblage of fuzzy creatures and made a short speech, pointing from time to time to his friends tied to the stakes. Logray became visibly upset by this. He waved his staff, stamped his feet, shrieked at the golden droid for a full minute. At the conclusion of his statement, he nodded to several attentive fellows who nodded back and began filling the pit under Han with firewood. "Well, what did he say?" Han shouted with some concern. 3PO wilted with chagrin. "I'm rather embarrassed, Captain Solo, but it appears you are to be the main course out of a banquet in my honor. He is quite offended that I should suggest otherwise." Before another word could be said, log drums began beating in ominous syncopation. As well, all the furry heads turned toward the mouth of the large hut. Out of it came Wicket, and behind him Chief Chirpa. Chirpa was gray of fur, strong of will. On his head he bore a garland woven of leaves, teeth, and the horns of great animals he'd bested in his right hand he carried a staff fashioned from the log bone of a flying reptile. In his left he held an iguana, who was his pet and advisor. He surveyed the scene in the square at a glance, then turned to wait for the guest who was only now emerging from the large hut behind him. The guest was the beautiful young princess of Alderaan. "Leia!" Luke and Han shouted together. "Your Highness!" With a gasp he rushed toward her friends, but her flanks of Ewoks blocked her way with spears. She turned to Chief Chirpa, then to her robot interpreter. "3PO, tell them these are my friends. They must be set free." 3PO looked at Chirpa and Logray. He said with much civility. Chirpa and Logray shook their heads with a motion that was unequivocally negative. Logray chattered an order at his helpers, who resumed vigorously piling wood under Solo. Han exchanged helpless looks with Leia. "Somehow, I have a feeling that didn't do as much good." "Luke, what can we do?" Leia urged. She hadn't expected this at all. She'd expected a guide back to her ship, or at worst a short supper and lodging for the night. She definitely didn't understand these creatures. "Luke?" she questioned. Han was about to offer a suggestion when he paused, briefly taken aback by Leia's sudden intense faith in Luke. It was something he hadn't really noted before. He merely noted it now. Before he could speak of his plan, though, Luke chimed in. "3PO, tell them if they don't do as you wish, you'll become angry and use your magic." "But Master Luke, what magic?" the droid protested. "I couldn't—" "Tell them," Luke ordered, uncharacteristically raising his voice. There were times when 3PO could test even the patience of a Jedi. The interpreter droid turned to the large audience and spoke with great dignity. The Ewoks seemed greatly disturbed by this proclamation. They all backed up several steps, except for Logray, who stood 2 steps forward. He shouted something at 3PO that sounded very in the nature of a challenge. Luke closed his eyes with absolute concentration. 3PO began rattling on in a terribly unsettled manner, as if he'd been caught falsifying his own program. "They don't believe me, Master Luke, just as I told you." Luke wasn't listening to the droid, though. He was visualizing him, seeing him sitting shiny and golden on his throne of twigs, nodding this way and that, patting on about the most inconsequential of matters, sitting there in the black void of Luke's consciousness, and slowly beginning to rise. Slowly, 3PO began to rise. At first, he didn't notice. At first, nobody did. 3PO just went right on talking as his entire litter steadily elevated off the ground. Told you! I told you! I told you they wouldn't! I don't know why you... What? Wait a minute! What's happening here? 3PO and the Ewoks all realized what was happening at just about the same moment. The Ewoks silently fell back in terror from the floating throne. 3PO now began to spin as if he were on a revolving stool. Graceful, majestic spinning. Help! He whispered. R2, help me! Chief Chirpa shouted orders to his cowering minions. Quickly they ran forward and released the bond prisoners. Leia, Han, and Luke enfolded each other in a long, powerful embrace. It seemed to all of them a strange setting in which to gain the first victory of this campaign against the Empire. Luke was aware of a plaintive beeping behind him and turned to see R2 staring up at a still spinning 3PO. Luke lowered the gold droid slowly to the ground. Thanks, 3PO. The young Jedi patted him gratefully on the shoulder. 3PO, still a bit shaken, stood with a wobbly, amazed smile. Why, I didn't know I had it in me. The hut of Chief Chirpa was large, by Ewok standards, though Chewbacca, sitting cross-legged, nearly scraped the ceiling with his head. The Wookiee hunched along one side of the dwelling with his rebel comrades, while the chief and 10 elders sat at the other side facing them. In the center, between the two groups, a small fire warmed the night air, casting ephemeral shadows on the ether walls. Outside, the entire village awaited the decisions this council would arrive at. It was a pensive, clear night, charged with high moment. Though it was quite late, not an Ewok slept. Inside, 3PO was speaking positive and negative feedback loops. Had already substantially increased his fluency in his squeaky language. He was now in the midst of an animated history of the Galactic Civil War, replete with pantomime, elocution, explosive sound effects, and editorial commentary. He even mimicked an Imperial walker at one point. The Ewok elders listened carefully, occasionally murmuring comments to each other. It was a fascinating story, and they were thoroughly absorbed, at times horrified, at times outraged. Logate conferred with Chief Chirpa once or twice, and several times asked 3PO questions, to which the golden droid responded quite movingly. Once R2 even whistled, probably for emphasis. In the end, though, after a rather brief discussion among the elders, the chief shook his head negatively with an expression of ruled dissatisfaction. He spoke finally to 3PO, and 3PO interpreted for his friends. Chief Chirpa says it's a very moving story, the droid explained, but it really has nothing to do with Ewoks. A deep and pressing silence filled the small chamber. Only the fire softly crackled its bright but darkling soliloquy. It was finally Solo, of all people, who opened his mouth to speak for the group. For the Alliance. Tell them this, Goldenrod, he smiled at the droid, with conscious affection for the first time. Tell them it's hard to translate a rebellion, so maybe a translator shouldn't tell the story. So I'll tell them. They shouldn't help us because we're asking them to. They shouldn't even help us because it's their own interests. Even though it is, you know. Just for one example, the Empire's tapping a lot of energy out of this moon to generate its deflector shield. And that's a lot of energy you guys are going to be without come winter. And I mean, you're going to be hurting. But never mind that. Tell them, 3PO. 3PO told them. Han went on. But that's not why they should help us. That's why I used to do stuff, because it was in my interests, but not anymore. Well, not so much anyway. Mostly I do things for my friends now, because what else is so important? Money? Power? Jabba had that, and you know what happened to him? Okay, the point is, your friends are your friends, you know. This is one of the most inarticulate pleas Leia had ever heard, but it made her eyes fill with tears. The Ewoks, on the other hand, remained silent, impassive. Teebo and the stoic little fellow named Paplu traded a few muttered words. The rest were motionless, their expressions unreadable. After another protracted pause, Luke cleared his throat. I realize this concept may be abstract, may be difficult to draw these connections, he started slowly, but it's terribly important for the entire galaxy, for our rebel force to destroy the Imperial presence here on Endor. Look up there, through the smoke hole in the roof. Just through that tiny hole, you can count 100 stars. In the whole sky, there are millions and billions, more you can't even see, and they will all have planets and moons and happy people just like you, and the Empire's destroying all of that. You can get dizzy just lying on your back and staring up at all that starshine. You could almost explode. It's so beautiful sometimes. And you're part of the beauty. It's all part of the same force. And the Empire's trying to turn out the lights. It took a while for 3PO to finish translating this. He wanted to get all the words just right. When he did eventually stop talking, there was an extensive squeaking among the elders, rising and falling in volume, ceasing, and then resuming again. Leia knew what Luke was trying to say, but she feared greatly that the Ewoks wouldn't see the connection. It was connected intimately, though, if she could only bridge the gap for them. She thought of her experience in the forest earlier, her sense of oneness with the trees, whose outstretched limbs seemed to touch the very stars. The star, whose lights filtered down like cascading magic. She felt the power of the magic within her, and it resonated around the hut, from being to being, flowing through her again, making her stronger still, until she felt one with these Ewoks, nearly felt as if she understood them, knew them, conspired with them. In the primary sense of the word, she breathed together. The debate wound down, leaving finally another quiet moment in the hut. Leia's respirations quieted, too, in resonance, and with an air of confident serenity she made her appeal to the council. "Do it because of the trees," she said. That's all she said. Everyone expected more, but there was no more. Only this short, oblique outburst. Wicket had been observing these proceedings with increasing concern from the sidelines. On several occasions it was apparent he was restraining himself with great difficulty from entering the council's discourse. But now he jumped to his feet, paced the width of the hut several times, finally faced the elders and began his own impassioned speech. 3PO translated for his friends. "Honorable elders, we have this night received a perilous, wonderless gift, the gift of freedom. This golden god," here 3PO paused in his translation just long enough to savor the moment, then went on. "This golden god, whose return to us has been prophesied since the first tree, tells us now he will not be our master, tells us we are free to choose as we will, that we must choose, as all living things must choose their own destiny. He has come, honorable elders, and he will go. No longer may we be slaves to his divine guidance. We are free. Yet how must we comport ourselves? Is an Ewok's love of the wood any less because he can leave it? No, his love is more. Because he can leave it, yet he stays. So it is with the voice of the Golden One. We can close our eyes, yet we listen. His friends tell us of a force, a great living spirit of which we are all part. Even as the leaves are things separate yet part of the tree, we know this spirit. Honorable elders, though we call it not the force, the friends of the Golden One tell us this force is in great jeopardy, here and everywhere. When the fire reaches the force, who is safe? Not even the great tree of which all things are part, nor its leaves, nor its roots, nor its birds. All are in peril forever and ever. It is a brave thing to confront such a fire, honorable elders. Many will die, that the force lives on. But the Ewoks are brave. The little bear creature fixed his gaze on the others in the hut. Not a word was spoken. Nonetheless, the communication was intense. After a minute like this, he concluded his statement. Honorable elders, we must aid this noble party, not less for the trees, but more for the sake of the leaves on the trees. These rebels are like the Ewoks, who are like the leaves, battered by the wind, eaten without thought by the tumult of locusts that inhabit the world. Yet do we throw ourselves on smoldering fires that another may know the warmth of light? Yet do we make a soft bed of ourselves that another may know rest? Yet do we swirl in the wind that assails us to send the fear of chaos into the hearts of our enemies? Yet do we change color, even as the season calls upon us to change? So must we help our leaf brothers, these rebels, for so has come a season of change upon us. He stood still before them, the small fire dancing in his eye. For a timeless moment all the world seemed still. The elders were moved. Without saying another word, they nodded in agreement. Perhaps they were telepathic. In any case, Chief Chirpa stood and without preface made a brief pronouncement. All at once drums began to beat throughout the entire village. The elders jumped up, no longer at all so serious, and ran across the tent to hug the rebels. Tebow even began to hug R2, but thought better of it as the little droid backed off with a low, warning whistle. Tebow scurried over to hop playfully on the Wookiee's back instead. Han smiled uncertainly. What's going on? I'm not sure, Leia answered out the side of her mouth, but it doesn't look too bad. Luke, like the others, was sharing the joyous occasion, whatever it meant, with a pleasant smile and diffused goodwill. Suddenly a dark cloud filled his heart, hovered there, nestled a clammy chill into the corners of his soul. He wiped its traces from his visage, made his face a mask. Nobody noticed. 3PO finally nodded his understanding to Wicket, who was explaining the situation to him. He turned with an expansive gesture to the rebels. We are now part of the tribe, just what I've always always wanted, said Solo. 3PO continued talking with the others, trying to ignore the sarcastic Star Captain. The Chief has vowed to help us in any way to rid their land of the evil ones. Well, short help is better than no help, I always say, Solo chuckled. 3PO was once again rapidly overheating his circuits toward the Corellian ingrate. Tebow says his chief scouts, Wicket and Poplu, will show us the fastest way to the shield generator. Tell him thanks, Goldenrod. He just loved irking 3PO. He couldn't help himself. Chewie let out a righteous bark, happy to be on the move again. One of the Ewoks thought he was asking for food, though, and brought the Wookiee a large slab of meat. Chewbacca didn't refuse. He downed the meat in a single gulp as several Ewoks gathered, watching in amazement. They were so incredulous at his feat, in fact, that they began giggling furiously, and the laughter was so infectious it started the Wookiee chortling. His gruff guffus was really hilarious to the chuckling Ewoks, so, as was their custom, they jumped on him with a frenzy of tickling, which he returned threefold, until they all laid in a puddle, quite exhausted. Chewie wiped his eyes and grabbed another piece of meat, which he gnawed at a more leisurely pace. Solo, meanwhile, began organizing the expedition. How far is it? We'll need some fresh supplies. There's not much time, you know. Give me some of that, Chewie. Chewie snarled. Luke drifted to the back of the hut and then slipped outside during the commotion. Out in the square, a great party was going on, dancing, squealing, tickling, but Luke avoided this too. He wandered away from the bonfires, away from the gaiety, to a secluded walkway on the dark side of a colossal tree. Leia followed him. The sounds of the Force filled the soft night air here. Crickets, skittering rodents, desolate breezes, anguishing owls. The perfumes were a mixture of night-blooming jasmine and pine. The harmonies were strictly ethereal. The sky was crystal black. Luke stared at the brightest star in the heaven. It looked to be fired from deep within its core by raging elemental vapors. It was the Death Star. He couldn't take his eyes from it. Leia found him like that. "What's wrong?" she whispered. He smiled wearily. "Everything, I'm afraid. Or nothing, maybe. Maybe things are finally going to be as they were meant to be." He felt the presence of Darth Vader very near. Leia took his hand. She felt so close to Luke, yet she couldn't say how. He seemed so lost now, so alone, so distant. She almost couldn't feel his hand in hers. "What is it, Luke?" He looked down at their intertwined fingers. "Leia, do you remember your mother? Your real mother?" The question took her totally by surprise. She'd always felt so close to her adopted parents, it was as if they were her real parents. She almost never thought of her real mother. That was like a dream. Yet now Luke's question made her start. Flashes from her infancy assaulted her, distortion, visions of running, a beautiful woman hiding in a trunk. The fragments suddenly threatened to flood her with emotion. "Yes," she said, pausing to regain her composure. "Just a little bit. She died when I was very young." "What do you remember?" he pressed her. "Just feelings, really. Images." She wanted to let it slide. It was so out of the blue, so far from her immediate concerns, but somehow so loud inside all of a sudden. "Tell me," Luke repeated. She felt surprised by his insistence, but decided to follow him with it, at least for the time being. She trusted him, even when he frightened her. She was very beautiful, Leia remembered aloud, gentle and kind, but sad. She looked deeply into his eyes, seeking his intentions. "Why are you asking me this?" He turned away, peering back up at the Death Star, as if he'd been on the verge of opening up, then something scared him, and he pulled it all in once more. "I have no memory of my mother," he claimed. "I never knew her." "Luke, tell me what's troubling you." She wanted to help. She knew she could help. He stared at her a long moment, estimating her abilities, gauging her need to know, her desire to know. She was strong. He felt it, unwavering. He could depend on her. They all could. Vader's here. Now, on this moon. She felt a chill, like a physical sensation, as if her blood had actually congealed. "How do you know?" "I can feel his presence. He's come for me." "But how could he know we were here? Was it the code? Did he leave out some password?" She knew it was none of these things. "No, it's me. He can feel it when I'm near." He held her by her shoulders. He wanted to tell her everything, but now as he tried, his will was starting to fail. "I must leave you, Leia. As long as I'm here, I endanger the whole group and our mission here." His hands trembled. "I have to face Vader." Leia was fast becoming distraught, confused. Intimations were rushing at her like wild owls out of the night, their wings brushing her cheek, their talons catching her hair, their harsh whispers thrilling her ear. Who? She shook her head hard. "I don't understand, Luke. What do you mean you have to face Vader?" He pulled her to him, his manner suddenly gentle, abidingly calm. Just to say it in some basic way released him. "He's my father, Leia." "Your father?" She couldn't believe it, yet of course it was true. He held her steady to be a rock for her. "Leia, I found something else out. It's not going to be easy for you to hear, but you have to. You have to know before I leave here, because I might not be back. And if I don't make it, you're the only hope for the Alliance." She looked away, she shook her head, she wouldn't look at him. It was terribly disturbing what Luke was saying, though she couldn't imagine why. It was nonsense, of course. That was why. To call her the only hope for the Alliance if he should die. Why, it was absurd. Absurd to think of Luke dying, and to think of her being the only hope. Both thoughts were out of the question. She moved away from him to deny his words, at least to give them distance, to let her breathe. Flashes of her mother came again in this breathing space, parting embraces, flesh torn from flesh. Don't talk that way, Luke. You have to survive. I do what I can. We all do. But I'm of no importance. Without you, I can do nothing. It's you, Luke. I've seen it. You have a power I don't understand and can never have. You're wrong, Leia. He held her at arm's length. You have that power too. The Force is strong in you. In time you'll learn to use it as I have. She shook her head. She couldn't hear this. He was lying. She had no power. The power was elsewhere. She could only help and succor and support. What was he saying? Was it possible? He brought her closer still, held her face in his hands. He looked so tender now, so giving. Was he giving her the power? Could she truly hold it? What was he saying? Luke, what's come over you? Leia, the Force is strong in my family. My father has it. I have it. And my sister has it. Leia stared full into his eyes again. Darkness whirled there, and truth, what she saw frightened her. But now, this time, she didn't draw away. She stood close to him. She started to understand. Yes, he whispered, seeing her comprehension. Yes, it's you, Leia. He held her in his arms. Leia closed her eyes tightly against his words, against her tears, to no avail. It all washed over her now and through her. I know, she nodded. Openly she wept. Then you know I must go to him. She stood back, her face hot, her mind swimming in a storm. No, Luke, no! Run away, far away! If he can feel your presence, go away from this place. She held his hands, put her cheek on his chest. I wish I could go with you. He stroked the back of her hand. No, you don't. You've never faltered. When Han and I and the others have doubted, you've always been strong. You've never turned away from your responsibility. I can't say the same. He thought of his premature flight from Dagobah, racing to risk everything before his training had been completed, almost destroying everything because of it. He looked down at the black mechanical hand he had to show for it. How much more would be lost to his weakness? Well, he choked, now we're both gonna fulfill our destinies. Luke, why? Why must you confront him? He thought of all the reasons to win, to lose, to join, to struggle, to kill, to weep, to walk away, to accuse, to ask why, to forgive, to not forgive, to die, but knew in the end that there was only one reason, now and always, only one reason that could even matter. There's good in him. I felt it. He won't give me over to the Emperor. I can save him and I can turn him back to the good side. His eyes became wild for just a moment, torn by doubts and passion. I have to try, Leia. He's our father. They held each other close. Tears streamed silently down her face. Goodbye, dear sister. Lost and found. Goodbye, sweet, sweet Leia. She cried openly now. They both did, as Luke held her away and moved slowly back along the planking. He disappeared into the darkness of the tree cave that led out of the village. Leia watched him go, quietly weeping. She gave free vent to her feelings, did not try to stop the tears. Tried instead to feel them, to feel the source they came from, the path they took, the murky corners they cleansed. Memories poured through her now, clues, suspicions, half-heard mutterings when they thought she was asleep. Luke, her brother, and Vader, her father. This was too much to assimilate all at once. It was information overload. She was crying and trembling and whimpering all at once, when suddenly Han stepped up and embraced her from behind. He'd gone looking for her, and heard her voice, and came around just in time to see Luke leaving. But only now, when Leia jumped at his touch, and he turned her round, did he realize she was sobbing. His quizzical smile turned to concern, tempered by the heart fear of the would-be lover. Hey, what's going on out here? She stifled her sobs, wiped her eyes. It's nothing, Han. I just want to be alone for a while. She was hiding something. That much was plain, and that much was unacceptable. It's not nothing, he said angrily. I want to know what's going on. Now you tell me what it is. He shook her. He'd never felt like this before. He wanted to know, but he didn't want to know what he thought he knew. It made him sick at heart to think of Leia with Luke. He couldn't even bring himself to imagine that it was what it was he didn't want to imagine. He'd never been out of control like this. He didn't like it. He couldn't stop. He realized he was still shaking her and stopped. I can't, Han. Her lip began to tremble again. You can't? You can't tell me? I thought we were closer than that, but I guess I was wrong. Maybe you'd rather tell Luke. Sometimes Oh, Han, she cried and burst into tears once more. She buried herself in his embrace. His anger turned slowly to confusion and dismay, as he found himself wrapping his arms around her, caressing her shoulders, comforting her. I'm sorry, he whispered into her hair. I'm sorry. He didn't understand, not an iota. Didn't understand her, or himself, or his topsy-turvy feelings, or women, or the universe. All he knew was that he'd just been furious and now he was affectionate, protective, tender. Made no sense. Please, just hold me, she whispered. She didn't want to talk, she just wanted to be held. He just held her. Morning mist rose off dewy vegetation as the sun broke the horizon over Endor. The lush foliage of the forest edge had a moist green color. In that dawning moment the world was silent, as if holding its breath. In violent contrast, the Imperial landing platform squatted over the ground, harsh, metallic, octagonal. It seemed to cut like an insult into the verdant beauty of the place. The bushes at its perimeter were singed black from repeated shuttle landings. The floor beyond that was wilting, dying from refuse disposal, trampling feet, chemical exhaust fumes. Like a blight was this outpost. Uninformed troops walked continuously on the platform and in the area, loading, unloading, surveilling, guarding. Imperial walkers were parked off to one side, square armored, two-legged war machines, big enough for a squad of soldiers to stand inside, firing laser cannons in all directions. An Imperial shuttle took off for the Death Star, with a roar that made the trees cringe. Another walker emerged from the timber on the far side of the platform. Returning from a patrol mission, step by lumbering step, it approached the loading dock. Darth Vader stood at the rail of the lower deck, staring mutely into the depths of the lovely forest. Soon, it was coming soon. He could feel it. Like a drum getting louder, his destiny approached. Dread was all around, but fear like this excited him, so he let it bubble quietly within. Dread was a tonic. It heightened his senses, honed a raw edge to his passion. Closer it came. Victory too, he sensed. Mastery, but laced with something else. What was it? Why, he couldn't see it quite. Always in motion, the future, difficult to see. Its aspirations tantalized him, swirling specters, always changing. Smoky was his future, thunderous with conquest and destruction. Very close now, almost here. He purred in the pit of his throat like a wild cat smelling game on the air. Almost here. The Imperial walker docked at the opposite end of the deck and opened its doors. A flanks of stormtroopers marched out in tight circular formation, a lockstep toward Vader. He turned around to face the oncoming troopers, his breathing even, his black robes hanging still in the windless morning. The stormtroopers stopped when they reached him, and at a word from their captain, parted to reveal a bound prisoner in their midst. It was Luke Skywalker. The young Jedi gazed at Vader with complete calm, with many layers of vision. The stormtrooper captain spoke to Lord Vader. This is the rebel that surrendered to us. Although he denies it, I believe there may be more of them, and I request permission to conduct a wider search of the area. He extended his hand to the Dark Lord. In it, he held Luke's lightsaber. He was armed only with this. Vader looked at the lightsaber a moment, then slowly took it from the captain's hand. Leave us. Conduct your search and bring his companions to me. The officer and his troops withdrew back to the walker. Luke and Vader were left standing alone, facing each other, in the emerald tranquility of the ageless forest. The mist was beginning to burn off. Long day ahead.